I come into the pits, I'm in first place. I go out, I'm in third with 2 laps.
Days of Thunder is the kind of movie that most people think they fully understand. Tom Cruise, NASCAR, the roar of engines, tire smoke, those near-limit turns, the shiny Hollywood lights of the early 90s. On the surface, it looks like just a movie that lives off speed. But the deeper you dive into this film, the more you realize the truly wild and sometimes dark stuff happens behind the scenes. The backstage chaos, the private relationships that throw the whole film off track, and the risky decisions. That's why Days of Thunder isn't just a racing film. It's one of the most bizarre Hollywood stories from that era. Today, we're going through the 20 weirdest facts about this film. And if you think you know Days of Thunder, maybe you're only familiar with what's on the track. Fact 20. This film was born at 180 miles per hour. Some films start in a meeting room. Some films start on a script page. But Days of Thunder doesn't. This movie seems to have fired up right on the racetrack, with the engine screaming the smell of burning rubber, and that feeling that just imagining it tightens your chest. Tom Cruise and Paul Newman were given real race cars to drive by Rick Hendrick. And for Cruise, it wasn't just a test lap. Right from the first turn, he hit over 180 miles per hour. Just thinking about that number is insane. It's not the kind of speed you cruise at. It's the kind that makes you grip the wheel, tight eyes locked forward, and everything around you starts blurring almost like it's being sucked off the earth. To me, that's so Hollywood of that time. Big, bold, a little crazy. A star touching real speed, then instantly wanting to turn that buzz into cinema. But like Hollywood always does, something that starts with a breathtaking shot often comes with even bigger cracks behind it. Let's move on to Fact 19. Fact 19. Behind the glamour of Days of Thunder was a big crack in Hollywood. If you remember the movie, the way I do, it always looked like a winner. Tom Cruise was at the top. Tony Scott was shooting America like everything was shining polished and running on high-octane fuel. Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer were basically the two names you could count on for big films. However you looked at it, it seemed like a sure hit. And that's the funny part. Hollywood doesn't remember a film the way the audience does. The audience remembers the feeling. The studio remembers the numbers. Days of Thunder wasn't a flop at the box office, but it didn't bring in that big win Paramount was hoping for in the summer of 1990. With such an expensive, loud, delayed, and ego-driven movie, that was enough to turn everything quickly. According to later accounts, Paramount reacted strongly. They slashed the budget for the third Beverly Hills Cop film and even demanded Simpson and Bruckheimer pay back $9 million from this movie's earnings to cover the shortfall. This wasn't a small disagreement anymore. This was a real crack. The two producers responded by saying they wouldn't work there anymore, and the door slammed shut before they moved on to a new chapter with Disney. A film can live long in the public's memory as an icon, but behind the conference room doors, it's remembered as a costly disappointment. And sometimes in the middle of a crack like that, a different, more romantic story quietly starts to unfold. Fact 18. This film didn't just bring Nicole Kidman to Hollywood, it brought her to Tom Cruise. Some meetings feel just like another audition. Then there are meetings where, when you look back, you realize an entire new chapter began right from that first moment. For Nicole Kidman, Days of Thunder was one of those stories. At the time, she was still a face moving toward Hollywood, not yet the icon audiences would later know. Then this film came along. It opened the door to the American market at a time when everything was still fresh, still new, still undefined. But what makes this story last longer than a typical casting detail is that Nicole Kidman didn't just find a role. She met Tom Cruise right at the audition for the film. A movie about speed engine roars and those near-limit turns, and yet one of the things people remember most is the moment these two people met under the studio lights. not on the red carpet, not after a big premiere, but from a simple professional ordinary audition. Only this time, it wasn't ordinary at all. That's the strange beauty of Hollywood back then. A film can launch a career, open a new era, and sometimes even spark a romance no one in the room saw coming. But as we'll see behind those beautiful moments, this film also had much darker corners. Fact 17. Behind a beautiful shot is a very ugly story. Here's a little challenge for you. Do you remember the Daytona Beach? The cars racing by like they're tearing through the frame, and at one point the seagulls fly up, making everything look even more cinematic. That's the kind of shot Tony Scott always knew how to sell to the audience. Big, beautiful, shiny, almost too beautiful to not get sucked into. But behind that beauty, there's a bloody truth. To get that shot, the crew spread food on the beach to lure the seagulls up for the perfect shot. The result, 2 birds died, and that led the American Humane Society to criticize the crew. I think what made this controversial isn't just the incident itself, but the fact that it's tied to such a beautiful shot. When you don't know any better, you see it as a piece of cinema full of poetry. But once you know the backstage story, that feeling doesn't stay the same. Fact 16. Before it even revved up, this film was already a massive gamble. If you want to understand just how big Days of Thunder actually was, sometimes the quickest way isn't to look at the turns or the crashes. Just look at the bill. And trust me, just that alone is enough to make you sit up straight. Different sources often place the budget for this film somewhere around $55 to $60 million. Now that sounds big today. But back in 1990, that was the kind of money that made Hollywood understand that this wasn't just a racing film anymore. This was a summer gamble, a real gamble. Not to mention, Tom Cruise was reportedly paid $9 million plus a percentage of the earnings. Just that detail says a lot. This film wasn't just built around a star, it was priced around that star. And that's the very essence of Hollywood back then that I always found both fascinating and a little crazy. Everything had to be big. The star had to be big. The sound had to be big. The images had to be big. And the money thrown into the film had to be big enough for everyone to understand that failure wasn't an option. With Days of Thunder, money wasn't just a backstage number. It was present in the very identity of the film. It made everything look glossier, louder, more ambitious, and yes, more dangerous. And when that much money's poured into a film, sometimes it only takes one person forgetting they're filming to send everything in a very different direction. Fact 15. The movie's driver unexpectedly forgot he was filming. This is one of my favorite stories about Days of Thunder because it's both funny and reveals more about the true essence of the movie than any ad campaign could. Hollywood did its best to make it look like real NASCAR. And then, at one point, real NASCAR reacted so strongly that it nearly swallowed the film part. In Phoenix, Bobby Hamilton was given a picture car to drive for the shoot. In other words, his job wasn't to win anything. He was there to help the camera get the shot. But when you put a real racer into a real car in a real racetrack environment, that racing instinct doesn't just sit quietly in the corner. And that's when Hamilton forgot he was working on a movie. He shot ahead like it was a real race, so much so that Rick Hendrick had to call him and tell him to back off. You can rewrite dialogue, reschedule races, even choreograph an entire season for cinematic pacing. But there's one thing that's much harder to stage: the reflexes of someone born to race. Just put them in the right environment, and the rest almost happens by itself. Fact 14. Days of Thunder feels like a true story, but it's based on none at all. The movie makes you feel like you're watching a true story. But the truth is, that's not the case. And that's the weirdest part. Days of Thunder wasn't adapted from any famous novel. It wasn't a biographical film about a specific driver. It was an original film idea created for the big screen. The thing is, the filmmakers weren't naive enough to sit in a cold room and imagine the entire world of NASCAR from scratch. They went out, grabbed real-life pieces, and brought them back. A little from this person, a little from that one. A fight here, a hot-tempered crew chief there. Then they mixed it all together like making a cocktail so strong that when the audience drank it, they thought it was pure truth. Fact 13. The wildest lines in the film were actually said in real life. One thing. Days of Thunder does really well, and most audiences don't notice immediately, is that it doesn't just borrow NASCAR's speed, it borrows NASCAR's language too. And if you've ever heard race car drivers talk to each other, you know it's never boring. A lot of the most memorable lines and conflicts in the film weren't completely made up in a Hollywood writer's room. They were pulled straight from real-life arguments, real egos, real grudges in the NASCAR world, especially around Harry Hyde, Jeff Bodine, Dale Earnhardt, and Bill France Jr. That's why many of the confrontations in the film feel so alive. Not the clever lines you might expect, but lines that smell like gasoline feel hot and give the impression that someone just threw them out while genuinely pissed off. And I think that's where Robert Towne's genius lies. He didn't just pick up events. He picked up the rhythm of the talk, the way people snapped, the way they threw jabs at each other in the racing world when politeness was off the table. So when Harry Hogg blows up, or when the tension in the garage starts getting as tight as a bowstring, the film doesn't feel like it's trying to write cool lines. It feels like someone out there actually said it that way. Fact 12. The most ridiculous detail in the film turned out to be true. In a film filled with engine roars, tire smoke, and egos hotter than the asphalt, there's one little detail that always makes me laugh every time I think about it. It's the moment when Cole Trickle doesn't get called into the pit, not because of some grand strategy, but because the crew was busy eating ice cream. Hearing that the natural reaction of most viewers is probably the same. Okay, now Hollywood's gone too far. But that's what's funniest about it. That detail didn't come out of nowhere. It's actually linked to a real story from the Southern 500 in 1987 involving Hendrick Motorsports number 35 team Harry Hyde and Benny Parsons during the time Tim Richmond was being replaced. In other words, what sounds like a writer's joke is based on a real event so unbelievable it's hard to believe. This strange truth reminds us that Days of Thunder didn't just borrow big ideas like rivalries, crashes, or ambition. It also grabbed small, odd, slightly ridiculous real-life moments and stuck them in the film so perfectly that the audience thought it must have been made up. Sometimes real life does have a weird, dry sense of humor, and NASCAR seems to be particularly good at it. Fact 11. Tony Scott destroyed dozens of cars just to get the shot right. At this point, I think we can straight up say this: if anyone on the Days of Thunder set was obsessed with speed, to the point of recklessness, it wasn't Cole Trickle, but Tony Scott. People watch this film and see cars spinning, bodies being smashed, and every crash flying at the screen like it wants to burst through it, and they usually think that's just the cost of making a racing movie. But the more I read about the behind the scenes, the more I realize it went beyond that. Tony Scott didn't just capture chaos, he hunted it. He pushed it to the exact shape he wanted. And to get that feeling of a crash strong enough, beautiful enough, and eye-popping enough, he destroyed dozens of cars. For Tony Scott, good enough never seemed to be an answer. He wanted the crash to hit hard. He wanted the debris to fly just right. He wanted the audience to not just see the speed, but feel it pressing against their chest. And honestly, that's the kind of image obsession that was very Hollywood at that time. Big, over the top, but unforgettable. So let me ask you this: if you were in his shoes, would you call that dedication to cinema, or simply going too far just for a good shot? Because the strange thing about this film is that just when you think you've seen enough craziness, it pulls out another detail that blurs the line between filmmaking and diving straight into an actual race. Fact 10. A movie that lives off sound was betrayed by sound on release day. For a movie like Days of Thunder, sound wasn't just decoration. It was half the soul of the experience. You could see the cars flying, you could feel the tires shaking, you could watch the bodies brushing by each other on the track. But without hearing the engines roar the right way, without hearing the impact pound your chest, this movie loses a huge chunk of its power. Right in its early theater release, Days of Thunder ran into trouble with Paramount's new digital cinema sound system. The issue was serious enough that some theaters had to switch to a 70mm Dolby stereo print just to keep showing it. Think about that. This is a film made to make the audience feel speed with both their ears and eyes. Yet right when it stepped out in front of the public, the very thing that fought it first was the sound. That's the irony that I can't forget about Days of Thunder. A movie about speed that sometimes wasn't slowed down by cars, actors, or the director, but by something the audience almost never sees. And if you look closely, you'll even spot small quirky details in the final credits that are so easy to miss. Fact 9. The end credits gave away more than people realized. Most audiences finish a movie, stand up, grab their coats, or start chatting about which scene was the coolest. I get that. But for movies like Days of Thunder, sometimes the most interesting part comes right when people think everything is over. Just by sticking around a few extra seconds at the end credits, this film gives away quite a bit about itself. In the credits, Days of Thunder thanks Hendrick Motorsports, NASCAR Bill France Jr., and ESPN. Just those names alone say a lot. They show that this movie didn't just sit outside and imitate the world of racing. It really touched that world, borrowing real people, real environments, and real levels of cooperation to create the feeling the audience experiences on screen. Fact 8. While making a movie about speed, Tom Cruise was actually caught speeding in real life. There are times when real life watches a movie and decides to join in. With Days of Thunder, that happened in the exact way that makes everyone laugh when they hear it. During the making of this movie, Tom Cruise got a speeding ticket. The number thrown around was 85 miles per hour in a 55 zone. Honestly, if this happened to an actor in some period film or family drama, no one would probably remember it. But it happened to the star of Days of Thunder, so it almost feels like the movie spilled out into the real world. But if that was just a funny coincidence, the stuff that happened deeper behind the scenes of the film wasn't as funny. At times, the whole production machine started veering off track in ways people never imagined. Fact 7. Some days, the shooting schedule was changed 3 times, and everything began slipping out of control. According to what's been reported, at one point during the tightest phase, the shooting schedule was changed up to 3 times in a single day. Just when it seemed like everything had been set, something would change. And then change again. To the point where the production manager, the person stuck in the middle of the storm, to keep the budget and plan together, had to confront Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer directly. The response he got was straight out of Hollywood back then: forget the schedule. That's what makes Days of Thunder feel like the cars in the movie themselves. On the outside, it still roared with confidence. But inside, every part started shaking. And when a movie gets to that point, sometimes just one more change can turn the whole set into a place where everyone's living off hastily scribbled script pages. Fact 6. A racing movie marked the end of almost 3 decades of Jerry Bruckheimer working with Paramount. People usually remember Days of Thunder because of Tom Cruise, Tony Scott, the engine sounds, and the smash-ups lighting up the screen. But from behind the studio doors, this film left another much colder milestone. For nearly 3 decades after that, this was practically Jerry Bruckheimer's last film released by Paramount. Bruckheimer had been with Paramount since the Michael Eisner days, during a time when the studio was a huge part of that flashy, commercial, confident Hollywood that audiences back then loved. But times changed, relationships changed, and after Days of Thunder, his trajectory changed too. With very few exceptions, most of Bruckheimer's later films ended up with Disney. Fact: 5 Days of Thunder quietly rewrote an entire NASCAR season. This movie knows how to make you believe in it. Not just believe in the speed, not just believe in the engine sounds or the crashes. It also makes you feel like you're going through a real NASCAR season, race after race, as if everything is happening just like it does in real life. But that's not exactly the case. If you look closely, the order of the races in the film doesn't match the real Winston Cup schedule for 1989 or 1990. For die-hard NASCAR fans, this is the kind of detail that would make them raise an eyebrow instantly. But what makes this fact interesting isn't that the movie got caught making a mistake. What's interesting is that most of the audience never even noticed, and that's where Days of Thunder gets clever. Fact 4. A former child star watched the movie and flat out criticized it. Too fake. The average moviegoer might sit there, hear the engines roar, watch Tom Cruise take turns like he's about to rip through the screen, and think, wow, this is awesome. But if you're someone who actually knows how the racetrack works, the story might be a little different. Brian Forster is one such case. A lot of people remember him as a child actor from the Partridge Family, but later he switched gears to racing and became a coach. And when Forster went to see Days of Thunder with his girlfriend, who was also a racing student, his reaction wasn't one of awe. He called the movie very fake and unnatural, and admitted that he spent the whole time in the theater pointing out one mistake after another. For a movie lover, Days of Thunder might be a beautifully packaged adrenaline rush, very flashy, very Tony Scott. But for someone who's lived with the smell of gasoline, the rhythm of pit stops, and the real logic of the racetrack, this movie sometimes felt like a version of NASCAR that had been polished by Hollywood so much that it lost its natural roughness. Fact 3. This movie started filming before the script was finished. This movie is about people racing at high speeds with no time to think, only to react. And funny enough, that's pretty much how the film itself was made. Days of Thunder started filming when the script was still unfinished. Not just tweaking a few lines here and there, but entire scenes were being written the day they were shot. In one driving scene, Tom Cruise actually had to read his lines from cue cards taped to the windshield. The result, he got into a small crash. Honestly, after hearing that, all I can think is only Days of Thunder would be crazy enough to do that. Later, the team had to come up with a new solution: special earphones so Cruise could hear his lines while driving. The film suddenly became alive in a very strange way. It didn't just tell the chaos of speed, it was born from that very chaos. And when a movie has to shoot and write at the same time, it's almost inevitable that it's going to miss its deadline. Fact 2. This movie only truly finished about 6 weeks before release. If Days of Thunder is a movie about people always driving as though time is chasing them, the irony is that the movie itself also lived in that exact feeling. Except, here's the thing on screen, they can make those turns just in time. In real life, with the release date looming over their heads, there wasn't much room left to fix anything. Many secondary sources claim that the production of the film went on for months longer than planned. And the detail that always gives me chills every time I read it is this: some sources say that Days of Thunder didn't wrap filming until about 6 weeks before the release. 6 weeks. For a big movie, loud with lots of racing crashes, sounds and a ton of pieces that had to be put together just right, that's almost like a mad dash with the shoelaces still untied. Fact 1. A movie about speed made Hollywood tighten its spending on big ego-driven blockbusters of the early 90s. I've always thought the biggest irony of Days of Thunder is right here. This is a movie born from speed, from engine sounds, from the feeling of pushing the gas to the limit. Everything around it is big. Big stars, big egos, big budget, big ambitions. It carries the exact vibe of Hollywood from the late 80s, early 90s, when the whole system still believed that if you made everything bigger, louder, shinier, success would just follow. And then, reality hit. When the movie didn't bring in the big victory that everyone had been waiting for, all that glamour was suddenly seen in a different light. What once looked bold started to be called reckless. What was once seen as personality started to be viewed as excessive. And Days of Thunder slowly became one of the examples that made Hollywood slow down and be more cautious with those big, money-driven, star-powered, ego-fueled blockbusters. That's what makes this movie much more memorable than a typical racing film. It didn't just leave behind cool shots, intense crashes, or that shiny Tony Scott light. It also unknowingly captured a moment in time when an era started showing cracks in itself. And maybe that's the best twist in the whole story. Days of Thunder was made to celebrate racing without hesitation. But when everything settled down, it became one of the films that made Hollywood realize that sometimes to survive, you need to know when to slam on the brakes. You think you're watching a story all about speed, while behind it is a whole Hollywood mess, money egos, glitches, love stories, crazy risks, and even those details that sound made up if there weren't real-life sources to back them up. As for me, I've always had a special fondness for movies like this. Not because they're perfect, but because they're too big, too loud, too shiny, too ambitious, and sometimes too much in the exact way that Hollywood used to live dream and confidently rush forward like there was no turn ahead. Of the 20 facts I just shared, which one surprised you the most? And in the next video, what movie's secret would you like me to uncover? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before you leave.